Hello. So today I will be discussing with you the conservation laws and mechanism in Sudan, and this to explore how different actors contribute in preserving our valuable assets and understand how they emerge and evolve through the time, and mostly to highlight the challenges that stand as barriers to these conservation goals. We will start from a larger scale to a smaller one. And at first, let's in the beginning go through the evolution of conservation field in Sudan and tracing how it started, the growing of an interest in the field of cultural heritage assets in Sudan started in the beginning of the bilateral rule in the British and Egyptian rule in 1899. And in contrary to earliest period of the Turkish rule on the Mahadism era, where for a human being, there were like when they see an agent, abandoned buildings, or they perceive those are home for devils and they must be kept away from. And as a result of those beliefs, these most traces were always left and no one tried to get near them. While in parallel, the destruction was not limited to the individual only, but also the governmental authorities of this period neglected these heritage sites and either left them for adventurers and treasure seekers to steal its holding or using its material for construction buildings. As in the Turkish era, during the Khurshid Pasha work of establishing Khartoum as a capital in 1830, most of the bricks used in building were coming from the ruins of Soba. We will find that the old government palace also was built from burnt brick from the Christian rules of Abu Habras, and that's like an evidence for how the government authorities perceive such sites. Moreover, we find in the Mahadism period, the Khalifa Abdullah House, which is now the museum, is also built from bricks from the Sobra ruins too. However, in the bilateral rule, witnessed the initial steps we can see for preserving the archaeological traces, and that started with having the first British general governor as responsible for the first antiquity service in Sudan, and that was in and that followed also the first antiquities laws. The management of these cultural heritage sites was mostly by foreigners until as the Sudanese national were not yet into the field, and until relative to the decision of the Sudanese committee, which refers to that they wanted foreigner from a neutral country, as at that time it was Sudan was yet colonized, and in that matter they had the French was appointed for the manager for the Sudanese antiquity. At only in 1960, when finally the Sudanese began to qualify themselves in this field, and Thabit Hassan was the first Sudanese director for the Sudanese antiquities. And that was the first initiative to development through how Sudanese national began to develop themselves into this field. Following this far, so far the year of 1999 witnessed and transfer in the name of Sudanese Antiquity Authority to the National Antiquity and Museum. We'll explain later in detail. When we are speaking about the management of cultural heritage resources in Sudan, currently the legal protection of cultural heritage applies in 3 levels. We have the national, regional, and institutional. First, by nature of the national government competencies and responsibilities in the field, we have the constitution and province that are acting as protect and conserve for their own cultural heritage. And secondly, the institution can be an NTAM, which is the National Corporation of Antiquities and Museum. They are responding in act for the constitution and also the antiquities laws. When we are speaking about the Sudan constitution at first scale, the constitution does not, there was like no explicit declaration addressing cultural or archaeological heritage in any aspect, neither for protection or conservation. It was only until the modified constitution of 1986 that it was the first to declare the worth and value of cultural heritage and archaeological. And only then in the second constitution in 1937, we see that when the constitution raised the interest for a regional scale to a territorial one. As first, it was only in how states should protect or conserve their own cultural heritage. And secondly, in this constitution, it became more as a national goal. Lastly, in the 1989, it was based on the evolution at that period by issuing new antiquities laws in 1992. The interest of archaeology had expanded in the country, and with this context, is also evolved through the constitution. And in the constitution of 2005, which is had mostly protection evolved. This constitution broadened the scope of protection to include all the resources that were relative, significant, determined. Moving forward, in speaking also about which are mechanisms that or actors that are working on or have contribution in preserving or conserving valuable assets, we have also the ministries that are working in these matters, and we have the Ministry of Planning, Ministry of Culture, Youth and Support, and of course the Ministry of Tourism, Antiquities and Wildlife. And another aspect, we have the antiquities laws, and for Sudan we have before 5 antiquities laws started from the 1905, which was the first one during the period of bilateral rule, and then the second law adopted as a conclusion of the colonial era in 1925, which was later modified in 1995 and upon the country's independence. And again, finally, which is an active today, is the Ordinance of the Protection Antiquities of 1999. What is interesting for us to witness is that how these different laws define what is antiquity, what is considered historical building, and what is considered archaeological site or archaeological land. And to understand how these definitions are evolved and started to become more to include more larger scale is interesting to witness. A second actor we can also see is NCAM, which is like the one of the oldest service in Sudan government, and they are acting upon with the Sudan Constitution and the Antiquities Laws of 1999. The first body to look after the archaeological heritage of the country, and it was created, of course, in the British administration, as we perceived earlier. And today, NCAM is attached to the Ministry of Culture, Youth and Sport. And what is interesting to see here about NCAM is always attached to it the French section in Sudan, which is since perceiving the management role of NCAM plays, they are always interfering when it comes to archaeological excavations or practice, which it was founded in 1976. And although they are funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Consular of Cultural Action at the French Embassy, they are reported directly to NCAM and help in the practice of the interest of preservation and protection of cultural assets. Moving forward is what we can understand for how states can perform in such field. And it's interesting that most of the issues that come here is regarded as a constraint in this scale is these laws are acting as the type of the administrative structure in Sudan that regulates and organize cultural heritage activities in mostly defined by the regime, agenda, and legislative regulation. Since Sudan federal system gives the state considerable autonomy in handling and managing cultural heritage concerns falling within their its boundaries, the differing interpretation of constitutional and institutional mandate texts creates conflicts when it's come to perform these laws between the national and the states in this matter. And today we see that this problem is enlarging to other one, where they extending for how the methods and intervention and the states, each state is concerning its heritage and cultural asset that fall in its boundaries, and then they are forming their own regulation, but of course they are still reporting to the national laws. Another, we can say, is effective parties, which is far from the constitution, the governmental bodies, we can say, is how there is like also educational parties. For example, the universities, as most, for example, if most of the university, they are getting their training and contributing to preservation and cultural preservation and conservation of cultural assets. And also we have the national private parties, as Sudan Archaeological Research Society, Sudan Archaeological Research, and also the urban episode is also new developing, and also in another international as UNESCO and other ALFE and other bodies. To last, when we are seeing that how the preservation of cultural heritage, it's interesting to see how the mechanism happens. So mostly in Sudan, when we are talking about, when we have cultural interest building, when the intervention or the conservation of these assets is either they are in their similar function, so the function it's not changing through the time, or also we have it's changing. So for example, we have the Khalifa House, which became, for example, a museum. We have the Angelical Church, which become also as a museum. So this is interesting to see when we are conserving or protecting a building or any cultural assets, what happened when it's concerning their function. Is it preserved? Is it going to be used? Or is going to be like an adaptive free use for it? Or it will be something to be just for the public, let's say public perceived as exhibition. And in another aspect is to speak about what are the challenges that we are facing today, that the conservation practice is confronting many challenges. Understanding the cultural significance and values is the main point that need to be considered. The place value, meaning, and also the impact of the intervention on how it's understood or perceived. Another important issue, of course, is the management context. So we are speaking here about the availability and the use of resources, including funds, training, personnel, and technology. And above all, of course, we are here having the lack of political will and initiatives. And for that, I will conclude my presentation. And thank you all. I'll be happy to answer your questions.